Hey everyone, and welcome to your personalized deep dive. Today we're diving into something you wanted to explore, the link between climate change exposure and, well, how companies decide what to do about their dividends.
Should be a fun one.
I think so, right? It's like
Right.
you want the insights without having to wade through a ton of technical jargon, right?
Exactly.
So that's our mission today, to make this stuff clear and, hopefully, pretty interesting too. We'll be taking a close look at some really recent research, a paper, actually. Came out just this year, 2024. It's called Climate Change Exposure and Dividend Policy. Evidence from Textual Analysis.
Oh, yeah, I've seen that one.
Good stuff. We're going to uncover some really fascinating stuff, I think. Like, does all this uncertainty around climate change actually make companies less likely to pay dividends?
Interesting question.
And why would companies choose to do those share buybacks instead of just giving out dividends when they're dealing with all these climate risks?
Lots to unpack there.
It's going to be good. So first things first, maybe we should define a couple of key terms here just so everyone's on the same page. Like when we talk about climate change exposure, what exactly do we mean?
Sure. In simple terms, it's how vulnerable a company is to all the stuff that comes with climate change.
Okay, so like the actual physical impacts.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know, wildfires or floods or whatever.
Exactly, yeah. But it's also more than that. It includes things like new regulations that governments might put in place to try and tackle climate change.
Yeah, like stricter rules on emissions or something. Makes sense.
And then there are also market forces to consider, like how consumer preferences might be shifting because of climate change.
Oh, right. Like if people are becoming more eco-conscious and they're starting to boycott companies that aren't doing their part.
Precisely. All of those factors combined, the physical risks, the regulatory changes, the shifts in consumer behavior, all contribute to a company's overall climate change exposure.
Okay, that makes sense. But how does climate policy uncertainty fit into all of this? Isn't that just kind of like part of the regulatory stuff we already talked about?
Well, it's related, but not exactly the same thing. Climate policy uncertainty specifically refers to how unpredictable and inconsistent those government policies are.
Okay, so it's not just about the regulations themselves. It's about how much those regulations are changing or how likely they are to change in the future.
Right. I think about it like this. Imagine a company's trying to decide if they should invest in, say, a new factory. And right when they're about to make that decision, bam, a whole bunch of new carbon regulations are proposed.
Whoa, okay. That throws a wrench in the works.
Totally. Suddenly the whole plan is thrown into chaos because they don't know what the rules are going to be. That's climate policy uncertainty in action.
I see. So it's kind of like you're trying to play a game where the rules keep changing all the time.
Exactly. And that can make a company's existing climate change exposure even worse.
Okay, that makes sense. So the more uncertain the policy landscape, the harder it is for companies to plan for the future and, protect themselves from climate change risks.
Precisely. The research actually used some pretty sophisticated stuff. They did a textual analysis of all these U.S. newspapers to try and create a climate policy uncertainty index.
Wow. So they were really digging deep into how the media was portraying all this.
Yeah, and they found that the greater that uncertainty was, the harder it was for companies to adapt and plan for climate change's impact.
So they're basically like left more vulnerable, right? More exposed.
Exactly, like trying to build a house on shifting sand. You just don't know what the ground is going to do next.
Got it, yeah. So, okay, now let's get to the heart of the matter. What does all this have to do with dividends?
Right. Well, this new research actually found a pretty significant link between how exposed a company is to climate change and how likely they are to pay out dividends.
And what did they find? Tell us.
They found that companies that are, more exposed to climate change are less likely to pay dividends. And if they do pay dividends, they tend to pay out smaller amounts.
Interesting. So is it as simple as companies just like hoarding cash because they're nervous about the future? Like battening down the hatches and waiting for the storm to pass?
Well, it's partly that, yeah. The researchers call it the precautionary hypothesis, which basically means that companies facing all this climate uncertainty tend to hold on to more cash, sort of as a buffer against potential disruptions.
So it's kind of like they're building a bigger emergency fund, right? Just in case things get rough.
Yeah, exactly. But it's not just about hoarding cash. They also need that money for, climate-related investments.
Oh, right. Like investing in renewable energy or making their operations more sustainable.
Exactly. Those things can cost a lot of money, and that money has to come from somewhere. And then there's also the issue of financing costs.
What do you mean by that?
Well, think about it from a lender's perspective. If you're a bank and you're thinking about giving a loan to a company, and that company seems really exposed to climate change risks, you might be a bit hesitant, right?
Yeah, for sure. It's like, why would you lend money to someone who's about to get hit by a hurricane?
Precisely. So lenders might charge higher interest rates to companies that they perceive as having greater climate risks.
So it's kind of like a climate penalty on top of everything else.
Yeah, you could think of it that way.
Yeah.
And that makes borrowing more expensive, which, again, eats into the cash that a company might have available to pay out as dividends.
Okay, that all makes sense. But what I don't get is, if companies are being so cautious with their cash and they're worried about climate change, why are they doing those share buybacks at all? Doesn't that also use up a lot of cash that they might need?
That's a great question. And this is where things get a little more strategic. See, dividends are kind of like a promise. Once a company starts paying them, they don't want to have to suddenly stop because of some, climate disruption. That would really spook investors.
Yeah, it'd make them look unreliable, for sure.
Exactly. But buybacks offer a lot more flexibility. It's like a one-time thing, or at least it can be.
So it's like saying, here's some cash now, but no guarantees about next year.
Right. And the study actually found that companies that are more exposed to climate change are, in fact, more likely to choose buybacks over dividends.
Really?
That's interesting.
It seems that they prefer that flexibility when the future feels really uncertain.
I see. So it's not just about having enough cash on hand. It's about having the agility to respond to whatever comes their way.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. But how can we be sure that it's actually the climate risk that's causing all of this? I mean, couldn't there be some other factor that's making companies both, riskier and more hesitant to pay dividends? You're right to be skeptical. Correlation doesn't always equal causation, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like, just because two things happen at the same time doesn't mean one is causing the other.
Right. It's like that classic example. People who drink coffee tend to live longer.
Right, but does that mean coffee is the magic potion?
Well, maybe. But it could also be that coffee drinkers just tend to have healthier lifestyles overall. It's hard to tease those things apart.
So how do we know it's the climate risk that's driving these dividend decisions and not just, I don't know, bad management or something?
Well, that's where the researchers get really clever. They use some pretty sophisticated statistical tools to try and isolate the impact of climate change exposure.
Okay, so they're really trying to make sure it's not just a coincidence.
Exactly. They wanted to be absolutely sure that climate risk was a driving force behind these dividend decisions.
Okay, so they're making a strong case that this connection is real.
They are. And I think it has some pretty big implications for how we think about investing in a world that's increasingly shaped by climate change.
For sure. This is already making me rethink how I look at companies and their choices.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing there's more to the story here, right?
Oh, absolutely. In the next part, we'll delve into exactly why companies exposed to climate change might be reducing their dividends. And it's about a lot more than just stashing cash.
I can't wait. This is already making me think differently about how I look at companies. Stay tuned, folks. It's about to get even more interesting. Welcome back. So last time we were talking about how, companies that are more exposed to climate change, well, they seem to be a bit less generous with those dividends, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And we were just about to kind of dig into the why of it all, right? Why is that the case? Is it really just about, building a bigger rainy day fund because the future feels so uncertain?
It's a big part of it for sure. If you're a company and you just know that climate change is going to bring all these more extreme weather events, well, it just makes sense that you might need to have a little extra cash on hand for, repairs and stuff, right?
Yeah, okay, if, I don't know, a hurricane comes along and wipes out a whole factory or something. But isn't that what insurance is supposed to cover?
Yeah, insurance definitely helps, but it doesn't always cover every single thing, right? Or sometimes those insurance payouts can be delayed. And then there are all these other costs that pop up that aren't always, directly tied to a specific event.
Like what kind of costs?
Well, think about that clothing company we talked about earlier, right? The one with the global supply chain.
Right, yeah.
So, if there are droughts that happen that make cotton way more expensive, well, that's going to eat into their profits, right?
Yeah, makes sense.
They might need to dip into those cash reserves to make up for it. Or what if their customers just start demanding more sustainable practices, all of a sudden?
Oh, yeah, that's happening more and more these days.
Right. And then the company might have to invest in all this new technology or new materials just to stay competitive. And that stuff can be really expensive.
Yeah, those are big expenses for sure.
Yeah.
It makes sense that that could eat away at the money they might otherwise use for dividends.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's not just about dealing with damage, it's about adapting to this like whole new business landscape that's being shaped by climate change.
Right.
Okay, but you mentioned something earlier about lenders getting spooked too, right? What's that all about?
Oh, right, yeah. So this is where things get even more interesting, I think. So, imagine you're a bank, right? And you're trying to decide whether or not to give a company a loan. Now, if that company seems, really exposed to climate risks, you're probably going to think twice about lending them money, right?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to lend money to someone who's about to get hit by a metaphorical hurricane, right?
Exactly. So lenders might end up charging like higher interest rates to those companies that they think have higher climate risk.
Ah, so it's like a climate penalty on top of everything else.
Right.
Kind of, yeah. And of course, that makes borrowing more expensive for those companies, which means less cash is available to, pay out as dividends.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. But let's go back to those buybacks for a second. You were saying that companies, they tend to prefer them because they're more flexible than dividends, right?
Yeah.
But is that really the whole story?
Well, sometimes companies might use buybacks to, let's just say, influence their stock price a little bit.
Okay.
How so? Well, if a company buys back a bunch of its own shares, it often, pushes the price up.
Right.
And that tends to make investors happy, at least in the short term.
Right. So maybe it's a way to appease those investors, even if the company is actually facing, all these climate challenges behind the scenes.
It's definitely possible. And it might be tempting for companies to prioritize those kinds of short-term gains, even if it means, kind of sacrificing long-term sustainability in the process.
So those buybacks aren't always this purely strategic move they're made out to be.
Yeah, sometimes it's more about managing perceptions than, actually managing risk.
Interesting. So what should investors be looking for? How can they tell the difference between a company that's using buybacks strategically and one that's maybe just trying to, sweep those climate risks under the rug?
That's a great question. And honestly, it's not always easy to tell, but I think it's really important to look at the bigger picture, right? What are the company's long-term plans for addressing climate risk?
Yeah. Are they actually making those necessary investments?
Exactly. And are they being transparent about the challenges they're facing and, the strategies they're putting in place?
So transparency is key here.
For sure.
Okay, so we've got companies, hoarding cash, investing in all this new stuff to try and adapt. They're facing higher borrowing costs, and they're potentially using those buybacks strategically.
Right.
This is a lot more complicated than I initially thought.
It really is. The relationship between climate change exposure and dividend policy is, it's complex, to say the least. And it really highlights how climate change is no longer just an environmental issue, right?
Yeah.
It's a core business concern.
Absolutely. And it sounds like investors really need to be paying attention to all of this, right? This should be on everyone's radar.
It should be.
Okay, so we'll explore those implications more in the next part of your deep dive. Stay with us, folks. We're about to dive even deeper. Welcome back to the final part of your deep dive.
I know, right?
Oh.
It's been a journey. We've been uncovering this fascinating, honestly kind of mind-blowing connection between climate change and what companies decide to do with their dividends.
It really has.
Yeah. Remember how we were talking about how climate uncertainty, all that can make companies act so differently, sometimes hoarding cash, sometimes making big strategic investments, sometimes maybe even using buybacks to sort of,
Manage expectations. Exactly. But okay, let's cut to the chase. What does all this mean for everyday investors? People listening to this, trying to make sense of it all.
The big takeaway here, climate change isn't some far-off threat anymore. It's hitting companies now. And you can see that impact playing out in their, financial moves.
So it's not just about saving the planet, right? It's about protecting your own investments too.
100%. If you're only paying attention to those classic financial things, earnings, growth, all that, you're missing a huge piece of the puzzle. Climate risk has got to be in there now.
It's almost like we need a whole new toolkit for figuring out how good a company is, this whole new world.
And that's where research like this comes in. It helps us understand these new rules of the game.
So what would you say to someone listening who's thinking, okay, this is wild, but what am I supposed to do about all this?
First off, don't panic. Knowing about it is half the battle, right? Now that you're aware of this link, you can actually start factoring in climate risk when you're making your own investment choices.
So if you're comparing two companies, right, And one seems super reliant on, I don't know, fossil fuels, old school stuff. But the other one is making moves towards renewable energy, being smarter.
Yeah.
Maybe that second company deserves a closer look.
Exactly. And don't be shy about asking questions. If a company isn't being upfront about their climate risks, what their plans are, red flag right there.
Yeah, like if they're not talking about it, maybe they're trying to hide something.
Could be. But the flip side, if a company is actively putting money into climate solutions, they're transparent, talking to stakeholders, that's a good sign. They're taking it seriously, positioning themselves well for the long haul.
It's about finding the companies that aren't just, like, adapting. They're leading the charge. Man, this deep dive has been, I don't know, it's eye-opening. Seeing the whole investment scene differently now.
Glad to hear it.
So, to everyone listening out there, remember this. Climate change is a financial factor now. No ignoring it. Do your research. Ask those tough questions. Invest in companies that are, actually building a future we can all be part of. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Keep learning, keep questioning, keep diving deep.